I'm going to really try to cover a couple things. One is just our general view of innovation, technology, and some of the opportunity it presents the economy, and sort of how we've commented on that in some of our reports. And then more specifically summarize the work that we've been doing as part of the FSOC working group on digital assets. I know this is a blockchain conference, not a digital asset conference, but the two are somewhat intertwined. I know people are interested in an update. So just very briefly, and I know some of you probably heard this, the President put out an executive order on the financial services system and set out core principles. So we've done a tremendous amount of work publishing 4 reports on banks, asset management insurance, capital markets, and lastly on non-bank financials and fintech. And while we didn't grapple extensively with blockchain, the message from the 4th report was that we support innovation. It's important to the U.S. economy. The U.S. can and is a leader in it, and that it presents a tremendous opportunity of change for the U.S. economy. With that change comes some threat and unknown, but we think it's a tremendous opportunity where we have U.S. dominance. So I would direct people to the Treasury website where these reports live, and the 4th one, as I mentioned, is the non-bank fintech innovation. And it really talks about attributes of technology and emergent technology such as AI, the cloud, and other things that you take for granted as being part of the new technology economy. But what we do is probe how it interacts with the regulated system. And technology is largely unregulated. Financial services is very highly regulated, and the real question is how do we effectively have those two things interact? So I think, I have a short time frame, so I'll just quickly go through that. Obviously, technology is unfolding at a very rapid rate, and that will continue. So we need to regulate with that in mind. Secondly, the digitization of finance is here, and there's a tremendous amount of data that can now be collected, can be used to the advantages of business and consumers in not only rendering financial services, but also having a stronger regulatory environment. The concept of RegTech suggests that regulators will use data better, and that presents an opportunity. First of all, there's almost an infinite amount of capital. There might be more capital than there are good ideas. You know, we've all seen the number of startups, and obviously the U.S. has a dominant home in not only raising that capital, but attracting investment capital. So that's a blessing. And some of the companies that are established companies in this are some of the largest market caps in the world and are very U.S. oriented in terms of their domination. And lastly, the nature of connectivity, the preference for connectivity, the proliferation of mobile devices is not slowing down. So what we really found several things is that, before I shift to the digital asset findings, first, consumer financial data can and will be used more effectively. We made a lot of recommendations how to modernize some dated regulation related to data access. Obviously, there's an element of protecting consumers that has to be part of the solution. And there's a sort of a series of federal and state laws that really sort of need to be modernized. One relates to security and data breaches and the nature of consumer notification. We made a recommendation for standardization. But we really want to remove the legal, regulatory, and sort of barriers of liability to use of data, which really permeates in some ways blockchain and any other emergent technology. The second thing is we have a lot of regulatory fragmentation of overlap, and I just listened to Hester. I really do agree this is a private market, and the government is not trying to unduly influence it or oversee it. But in the financial services area, we're blessed. I'll use the word blessed with a lot of regulators because they're sort of largely chartered around functions. We have 2 market regulators in the SEC and the CFTC. And for prudential regulators, there's different regulators by the type of institution, a credit union regulator, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the FDIC, and a series of state regulations. So really the biggest thing we've really advocated for is really to have harmonization between the different regulatory regimes and not sort of be a barrier to success of innovation. We support the concept of a federal charter. The OCC has put forward a concept of a national bank charter. There might be other approaches, but really definitely having entities that are subject to regulation by 50 states and they're pursuing a virtual internet-enabled practice seems very challenging, and that could impact negatively blockchain and digital assets as well. And also just, again, the modernization of the framework of allowing connection with the mature sector. So we think a lot of success will be new companies partnering with existing and very established institutions, and that results in some change in regulation about how vendor management and third-party management works, and we encourage that very much. There was a very large section in our report on regulation and activity-based regulation. It ranges from loan servicing, lending, payments, you name it. It's way too numerous to address here, but there's just a lot of rules that just were created in a different environment and need to be modernized. And so we did do a catalog of those. Many involve legislative changes and not necessarily major heavy lifts, but they do involve Congress acting, and they're not just with the financial regulators, with the FCC, the FTC, and other areas. And finally, you know, the word regulatory sandboxes is sometimes overused, but it's very obvious that if you have a sort of a brand new thing, the existing regulation doesn't fit it. And if there's multiple regulators with an overlapping mandate, it's critical that we find a way for those regulators to inherently allow safe experimentation on new concepts, agree for periods of proof of concept, and sort of lay out a path how those innovations can be adapted. I know Chairman Giancarlo is speaking after me, and they, among all the other regulators, have launched an innovation lab. So I think regulators are interested in modernizing, and it's a key part of it. So in the blockchain and digital assets, I want to just give you a brief update on where we got to. Secretary Mnuchin announced a working group among the FSOC members in late 2017 to explore the developing market for digital assets and enhance interagency education and coordination. FSOC is the council of 10 different regulators, including state appointees and other non-voting members. That group was, the core group was the CFPB, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the CFTC, and the SEC. And we met numerous occasions. We had a principal group and we had a deputy group. So I'd say the first effort focused on three things: one, mutual education and information sharing. So I think the level of play of what we know about this is shot way up. It's an area that's actually hard to collect information on, and the new trade groups and many of your advocates, and it's very helpful to have this input. Second, we did a stock take of current authority pertaining to digital assets to inventory what is the current authority and how should that change. And lastly, we talked about the international landscape and the global nature of this digital asset economy, which presents challenges to understand, you know, how regulation and market oversight should occur. So to be really clear, no one wanted to regulate technology. And one of the challenges is the blockchain use cases, while regulators might appreciate them, the financial regulators really have no role in regulating technology. So an important thing we tried to do was bring into the room the use cases, how they're changing, and why it's important to talk about. I think we did a good job, and again, the knowledge sharing went way up. So we had a few work streams that we set up. One was evaluating the range of digital assets and use cases. So a nomenclature of types of digital assets arose from that. We assessed the money laundering and illicit financing risks associated with digital assets. The Department of Justice participated with the financial regulators and our FinCEN division on that front. We evaluated rigorously the operational risks inherent in digital assets, including cybersecurity concerns and those associated with different activities such as mining, storage, custody, exchange, and payment processing. We evaluated the range of consensus mechanisms and governance structures, which obviously has some impact on nomenclature of type of digital asset, but also implications for potential operational risk and other considerations. And last, we looked at the exposure of the financial system, and largely the regulated institutions don't have very much exposure to digital assets, but would like to have more with a clear environment, and many of the activities are conducted outside established vendors. For instance, the nature of ICOs and other activities. And finally, we did an international stock take of what was happening internationally in the space. So I think everyone here should rest comfortably that we've done a really thorough review. I think all the regulators are very much have raised our game of understanding what you're trying to do, and we've drawn several key conclusions. Now, what one key conclusion is that the digital assets are very widely varied in both their structure and use, so it's not certainly an asset class. So some seek to act like fiat currencies, although they lack government banking, of course. Some seek to be fiat currency substitutes, and they're explicitly linked or collateralized by a fiat currency or a commodity that's readily exchangeable into currency. Some are bond-like in that they offer a contractual right to return that's fixed or derived from a formula. And some, including ICOs, are equity-like in that they derive their value from an ongoing to-be-completed project that's designed to create some utility or value for the holder of the digital asset. So one conclusion is that in our regulatory system, there are established approaches to these various types of instruments. So a possibility is, rather than creating a new environment, is try to direct the audience to the current environment that exists, which would be a way of disciplining an approach given these wide ranges of types of assets. So in short, Treasury and the work of the FSOC supports the steps the SEC has taken in developing appropriate regulatory responses to concerns around market transparency, market manipulation, and the need for suitable disclosures in the case of ICOs. The SEC set forth some clear and principled frameworks of their approach to the oversight of the ICO market in particular, with setting expectations of exchanges and intermediaries and the need to protect retail investors. Also, the SEC has been actively engaged with the public, industry, and regulators to encourage responsible innovation through a strategic hub for innovation and financial technology, or their FinHub. So in a moment, you'll hear from Chairman Giancarlo, and so I don't want to steal his thunder, but he deserves a lot of credit with the FTC for framing key concepts around an initial thought process of digital assets. When we started our work, sadly, there was a bubble, and the bubble was a tremendous valuation increase in existing digital assets, which resulted in a large influx of new offerings. And his idea was very simple, was he wanted to do no harm to approach the innovation, but did think that price discovery would be extremely productive. So they led the effort of self-certification of futures contracts and Bitcoin that unfolded at the CBOE, the CME, and the Cantor Exchange, which actually presented a very large increase of institutional awareness and participation, and also the opportunity for price discovery in a more traditional manner for a financial asset class. Obviously, the CFTC, through its lab, CFTC has been an excellent example of promoting innovation, and I'm sure Chris will talk quite a bit about how he supports DLTA and innovations such as this and encourages involvement at his agency and across all the agencies. So it's been also with the SEC tremendous leadership. One of the toughest parts about our work has been dealing with the nature of illicit activities. And our TFI group in Treasury, which is the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and also OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, find themselves in a position of being sort of uncompromising in mitigating the risk of illicit, the risk arising from digital assets. So what they've really tried to do is create a regulatory regime that mirrors what they do with other institutions for businesses that are involved in money transmission, and implement procedures that sort of implement Know Your Customer and also BSA AML standards. So what we want to avoid is sort of an asset class that evolves for a good purpose in the evolution of technology that falls in the wrong hands and ends up being a transfer of value and payments to support illicit activities or to work around the sanctions that we are introducing to protect national security. So really the working group, I think, all bonded together to say that we need to reinforce our strong civil and criminal enforcement actions in administrative proceedings and federal court to combat these activities related to digital assets. We did learn in the working group that sadly it does appear at many crime scenes. So when you have a bust and you find the usual cadre of jewels and cocaine and Rolls Royces, unfortunately you also tend to find digital assets now. So clearly criminals are storing value in these assets. It's not totally proven to what extent they're a transmission mechanism for the criminal activity, but this is obviously a tremendously high concern. So I think this will help the industry ultimately by being vigilant on it. It may not sound particularly positive, but we really do think it ultimately is a showstopper if we can't create an appropriate mechanism. Now, one of the real problems of this is the international dimension, and obviously we can affect behaviors with our exchanges. But then, because it's a ubiquitous asset, parties can then exchange the assets around the world. So our FinCEN group, a leader of it, is now chairing the FATA for the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international standard-setting body. We definitely do not think digital assets represent a financial stability risk, but this is an area where we think international involvement is extremely important. And what we're really trying to do on that stage is to set a level playing field of the standard of monitoring financial activities that involve digital assets, trying to sort of monitor the exchange and other features. So in addition to the market making and transparency issues that our market regulators are pursuing, that the appropriate regulator in each jurisdiction is also keeping in mind the control of the illicit activities. So I would have everyone be very mindful as you sort of study the environment, but that's an area where the government's unlikely to be at all compromising, and it's, again, kind of a showstopper where you could have 99 things go great, and if there's one really serious incident involving national security, terrorism, or money laundering, it becomes kind of a showstopper for the evolution. So I'd say that became one of the overarching themes. So I guess in short, we are not going to issue a major report. We instead are supporting what the SEC's done, the CFTC's done, and FinCEN. We expect to put out additional communications as we unfold on sort of updates. I know many are trying to move faster to get answers. Whenever I talk to people in blockchain or digital assets, I put in the context of the broader financial technology sector. All of this is really new, and it's still very young in terms of the potential it represents for the U.S. economy and how the regulatory structure has to evolve. So we're very supportive of the entire space. I think the exercise we've done have made the regulators very unified in sharing knowledge and developments, and we really welcome ongoing input from market participants. Many of you, I'm sure, participated in forums or information exchanges, because we can only make great decisions if we have the best possible information. So I'd really encourage active involvement in policy and advocacy, and all of you being here in Washington today is an excellent commitment towards that. So thank you very much.